Right, we've got some breaking news from the United Kingdom and the royal family. Recently, a fresh wave of alarming signals from the heart of the British monarchy has sent shockwaves through the public. In the wake of King Charles's increasingly frail public appearances and visibly exhausted demeanor, tense discussions are said to have erupted behind the historic walls of Buckingham Palace about the future of the throne. The names of Prince William and Princess Catherine have suddenly surfaced as a possible early succession plan that could dramatically reshape the entire royal landscape. Yet at this highly sensitive moment, Queen Camilla has found herself at the center of an intense storm of speculation. Multiple leaked reports suggest she is far from willing to be sidelined from the corridors of power. Behind her familiar, calm exterior, sources claim may lie a silent but fiercely determined counteroffensive. As damaging rumors continue to swirl around William and Catherine, all eyes are now turning to Princess Anne, the Iron Lady of the Royals, who has always remained silent yet has never stood on the sidelines during the monarchy's most seismic crisis. Is Camilla desperately fighting to cling to her final vestiges of influence, or is she in fact the hidden force behind the covert strikes targeting William and Catherine? And will Anne be the one to expose everything in order to save the monarchy, or is she herself preparing to unleash a bombshell secret that could shake the palace to its core? Beneath the ancient domes of Buckingham Palace, the air these days felt thick, with a heavy, oppressive silence. After a turbulent 2025 filled with packed schedules from overseas tours to traditional commemorative ceremonies, the health of King Charles III, monarch who had always striven to project an image of endurance, had finally reached its breaking point. King Charles III, who had spent his entire life waiting for the moment he could serve the kingdom, now found himself facing his greatest enemy, time and the frailty of his own body. In the 3 years since his official coronation, he had tried to modernize the monarchy, but the lingering effects of his health issues and the immense workload had drained the last of his strength. Every step he took was no longer a symbol of royal authority, but a monumental effort against the constant gnawing pain. Seated across from him in the study, bathed in the pale golden light of late afternoon, was Prince William. William was no longer the eager young prince of the previous decade. He carried the quiet composure of a man ready for the greatest responsibility of all. In recent years, the relationship between father and son had shifted from simple familial affection to a tightly knit political alliance. William understood that every labored breath his father took was a tolling bell signaling the inevitable transition. That closed door meeting was devoid of the clink of glasses, filled only with the heavy rustle of turning documents. Senior advisors from the Privy Council, strategic minds behind the survival of the dynasty, began presenting figures and charts on the sharp decline in public confidence should the throne continue to display such weakness. Bold but necessary proposal was put forward, an early power transition plan that would place William and Catherine on the throne, injecting fresh vitality into the nation. Silence enveloped King Charles. His eyes gazed distantly at the portrait of the late Queen, his frail hands clasped tightly together to hide their trembling. He understood the cruelty of reality, that the crown was a burden his shoulders could no longer bear with steady strength. Yet the thick atmosphere was suddenly shattered by a sharp, resolute voice laced with extreme determination. Queen Camilla, who stood beside the throne not only as a wife but as a seasoned strategist, spoke up. She had weathered countless storms of public scrutiny alongside Charles to reach this position, and she was not prepared to watch it all end so abruptly. Camilla did not look at the advisors, her gaze fixed directly on William, the stepson. She had always treated with careful respect, but never truly understood. In her heart, William and Catherine's early ascension was not merely an administrative handover. It was a denial of her own era. If Charles stepped aside, her status would instantly become that of Queen Mother, a title of honor, yet one marked by isolation and the loss of direct influence over royal decisions. She argued in a calm tone that carried undeniable authority, claiming that changing the succession at this moment would be a betrayal of the stability the king had worked so hard to build. She wielded words like tradition, loyalty, and dangerous haste to erect a barrier between the advisor's will and harsh reality. Her eyes swept over her husband's weary face, not with the tenderness of a wife, but with a cold calculation of someone defending her final fortress. William sat motionless. He sensed the silent but fierce confrontation from his stepmother, He did not argue, for he knew that in this palace real battles were never waged with raised voices, but with meaningful glances and loaded silences. The meeting ended without any official decision, leaving the advisors in a haze of unease. As the others departed, Buckingham Palace sank into the shadows of dusk. Camilla returned to her private chambers, a room overlooking the vast palace courtyard where guards still performed their unchanging changing of the guard ritual. She stood by the window, the lamplight casting sharp contrasts of light and shadow across her face. The fear of a future forgotten of losing, the influence she had spent decades cultivating, surged through her more powerfully than ever. She reached out and lightly touched the cold glass, her gaze directed toward the wing where William and Catherine resided on the opposite side of the palace. A new era was poised to erupt, and she felt like an aging fortress wall trying to hold back an oncoming tidal wave. "I will not let it all slip away so easily," she whispered, her voice dissolving into the empty silence, yet her eyes burned with a chilling, terrifying resolve. Behind the throne, a shadow of calculated schemes began to descend, heralding a covert war that threatened to tear apart the fragile illusion of peace within the British royal family. The morning light of London could not penetrate the heavy velvet curtains in Queen Camilla's private study. In the space thick with the scent of sandalwood and old paper, she began the first moves on the chessboard of power that she had quietly arranged. Camilla understood that, to stop the rise of William and Catherine, she could not rely on overt force. Instead, she would weave an intricate web of tangled alliances and subtle psychological manipulation. She started with discreet afternoon teas, inviting the oldest and most trusted advisors of the royal household. In these meetings, Camilla never directly criticized William. Instead, she employed carefully crafted questions that sowed seeds of doubt with exquisite skill. She frequently recalled minor past mistakes of the young prince, or let out thoughtful sighs when mentioning Catherine's lack of experience in handling complex diplomatic crises. Her eyes always carried a feigned concern that made those around her begin to feel that entrusting power to the younger generation at this moment was a dangerous gamble. Her actions were as meticulous as a master embroiderer. She gave small gifts and wrote short handwritten notes laden with implication to influential members of the British aristocracy. She stirred in them the fear of too abrupt a change of a new reign that might sweep away the traditional privileges they had long enjoyed. Gradually, a faction of advisors who had been wavering in the face of King Charles's declining health began to shift their allegiance toward the stability that Camilla now represented. However, Camilla's ambitions extended far beyond the stone walls of the palace. She understood all too well the brutal power of modern media. In a dimly lit corner of an exclusive Mayfair bar, a secret meeting took place between her most trusted representative and a team of Black Ops crisis management experts. Camilla did not appear in person, but her instructions were conveyed clearly through thick stacks of documents. The plan they drew up was ruthlessly calculated. A systematic smear campaign aimed directly at the perfect couple image of William and Catherine. Not through crude insults, but through seemingly objective analytical articles that raised questions about William's psychological readiness for the throne. The team began exploiting moments when William appeared irritable or fatigued in front of the cameras, framing them as evidence of his lack of the necessary composure for a monarch. Camilla's state of mind during this period was a volatile mix of exhilaration and extreme anxiety. Each time she saw the first articles appear with ambiguous headlines about the leadership readiness of the next generation, a thrill ran down her spine. She walked the palace corridors with an unnaturally calm demeanor, yet her hands often clenched the fabric of her dresses, a telltale sign of the tension beneath the flawless mask she maintained in front of her increasingly frail husband. She frequently observed William from a distance through the palace windows, watching the prince still diligently poring over reports, completely unaware of the underground storm approaching. Camilla allowed herself a cold little smile. To her, this was a battle for survival. Every rumor released, every seed of doubt planted, was another brick in the wall preventing William from reaching the crown. When night fell, Camilla sat before her dressing mirror, removing each heavy piece of jewelry. In the reflection, her face no longer held its usual gentle expression, only the icy sharpness of a woman who held the tangled threads of an entire dynasty in her grasp. The first malicious rumors had already begun to flicker to life on forums and tabloid pages, signaling an impending media storm that threatened to engulf the radiant image of the future king. The London sky had turned to lead and grey, mirroring the suffocating atmosphere enveloping Kensington Palace. What had begun as a few scattered rumours on social media had now erupted into a full-blown media firestorm across tabloids and respectable broadsheets alike. Aggressive questions about William and Catherine's competence appeared in relentless waves. Every small gesture of William's was dissected. His calm silence was labelled as awkward hesitation, while Catherine's reserved nature was cited as proof that she lacked the steel to face the nation's political upheavals. Standing in his private study, William stared silently at the computer screen as news alerts flashed continuously. Fingers drummed a steady rhythm on the oak desk, a habit that surfaced whenever he fought to contain the fury boiling inside his chest. He could clearly feel an invisible hand shaping public opinion, twisting his tireless work into meaningless figures. The prince's mind was a turbulent mix of disappointment and disbelief. He wondered how internal details about his private training sessions had been so skillfully distorted to fuel these defamatory pieces. Doubt crept into his thoughts. Not doubt in himself, but suspicion toward those moving within the palace walls. Meanwhile, Queen Camilla maintained a composure that was nothing short of astonishing. She appeared at public events with a gentle smile, occasionally pausing to offer comfort to citizens worried about the king's health. Her actions were light, yet meticulously calculated. She artfully displayed a face of quiet sorrow under the weight of royal duty, as if she alone were shouldering the monarchy while the heirs apparent faced growing public scrutiny. That very calm of Camilla's was a cunning psychological strike, sharpening the contrast between a beautiful queen and a controversial heir couple in the eyes of the public. The turning point came on a late afternoon when Princess Anne, known as the hardest-working member of the royal family, sought out William. Anne embodied discipline and unwavering loyalty to the crown. She entered the room with decisive steps, her sharp eyes and the eyes that had witnessed every rise and fall of the reign, locking onto her nephew. Without wasting words, she placed a concise report on the table, detailing unusual fund transfers from an unofficial trust linked to the Queen's auxiliary offices. Anne's presence carried an electric charge of both urgency and tension. She spoke not of affection, but of cold facts. Secret meetings between Camilla's staff and right-wing media moguls. Her gaze burned with the indignation of someone who could not tolerate personal ambition being placed above the interests of the monarchy. She silently pointed to names and timelines that aligned precisely with the surge of negative articles. A piercing clarity suddenly ignited in William's mind. The earlier suspicion now crystallized into a clear objective. He looked out the window where the first raindrops had begun to fall, blurring the majestic palace grounds. William was no longer a son enduring injustice. He had become a leader facing his first true test of betrayal. William turned to Anne, his eyes hardening with steely resolve. A secret investigation was officially launched deep within the palace, where every wall had ears and every shadow could be an enemy. If someone is behind this, we will find them. His silent declaration rang like an oath, signaling the collapse of a dark alliance and the beginning of a dramatic hunt for the truth. The silence in the corridors of Kensington Palace no longer carried its usual calm. It now breathed with the tension of a silent hunt. William began his days with an almost ferocious focus. Guided by Princess Anne and her extensive internal intelligence network, he started peeling back the layers of the media campaign that had surrounded him. Every move he made was cautious, like a sapper diffusing mines in the dark, where even the smallest misstep could destroy his reputation before the truth had a chance to surface. William's actions grew colder and more decisive. He spent hours in the secure study, cross-referencing financial statements and palace entry logs. Through Anne's trusted connections within the royal security services, they uncovered a shocking truth. A small group of communication staff officially attached to Queen Camilla's support office had been holding frequent unofficial meetings with tabloid editors at locations beyond the palace's oversight. William's emotions during this period shifted from deep disappointment to a deadly calm. He no longer felt pain at the slanderous headlines. Instead, he viewed them as clues. Every vicious article became a footprint leading back to the mastermind. The last remnants of respect he held for his stepmother were shattered, replaced by disgust at her willingness to exploit his father. King Charles's failing health as a shield for her personal ambition. On Camilla's side, The instinct of a woman who had spent her entire life surviving the treacherous waters of the royal family began sounding alarms. She noticed the change in the Williams' demeanor, not explosive anger, but a threatening indifference. She sensed the probing eyes of Anne's security team. In response, Camilla intensified the pressure. She ordered her shadow media team to launch one final wave of attacks, emphasizing that King Charles remained fully lucid and that any attempt at change would be an act of filial betrayal and treason. She meticulously erased digital traces, destroyed draft manuscripts, and commanded her subordinates to maintain absolute silence. Yet William's persistence yielded results in a modest apartment on the outskirts of London. A young communications staffer who had personally drafted many of the smear pieces began to crack under the pressure from Anne's investigators. The fear of imprisonment for treason and betrayal of the crown outweighed his loyalty to Camilla. In a windowless interrogation room, the man trembled as he handed over a hard drive containing recorded phone calls and direct emails issued from Queen Camilla's office. When William held the bundle of ironclad evidence in his hands, the black text on white paper cut through the fog of lies like sharp blades. He stood motionless beside his desk as pale moonlight streamed through the window, illuminating the resolute face of the future king. The rage inside him no longer erupted outward. It sank deep, crystallizing into a cold, unyielding power. William gripped the documents tightly, his gaze fixed on the darkness of the palace gardens with unshakable determination. The truth was now in his hands, and the time had come to drag the war out of the shadows and into the light. The truth is about to be revealed was no longer just a thought. It was a verdict he was ready to deliver before the most powerful council in the kingdom. The atmosphere inside the Royal Advisory Council chamber at Buckingham Palace was so heavy, it felt as though a single deep breath might shake the walls lined with portraits of past monarchs. The advisors, seasoned politicians, and the highest-ranking members of the royal bloodline sat around the long mahogany table, every face etched with extreme tension. At the center of attention stood William. He remained upright, his expression as unyielding as granite, his hands resting lightly on a black leather-bound dossier, the evidence that would end the long illusion of peace. Beside him, Princess Anne maintained a terrifying composure. She needed no words. Her presence alone served as a steel pillar guaranteeing the authenticity of what was about to be revealed. Across from them, Queen Camilla sat with her usual elegant posture, but her fingers gripped her small handbag so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She fought to keep her face perfectly still, her eyes staring into empty space. Yet her quickened breathing betrayed the calm she tried to project. William began speaking in a low, resonant voice that carried solemn authority. Each page he turned was a knife driven straight into the web of lies Camilla had so carefully constructed. Financial charts revealed murky fund flows, copies of encrypted emails, and crystal-clear audio recordings of her closest associates negotiating with the media. William used no emotional language. He let the truth speak for itself. With every piece of evidence presented, the advisors exchanged glances filled with shock and outrage. They could hardly believe that while King Charles battled illness, his own wife had been orchestrating a campaign to destroy his designated successor. Cornered Camilla's composure began to fracture. Her initial denials no longer carried the confidence of a queen, but the desperate resistance of a woman watching her empire crumble. She tried to argue that it was all a misunderstanding, that her actions had only been meant to protect the king from the pressures of a premature power transition. She painted a picture of false stability, attempting to stir loyalty among the aging advisors. Yet when her eyes turned toward William, they burned with an unmistakable hatred, a raw exposure of the ambition she had long hidden behind a mask of benevolence. The decisive moment came when William presented a direct communication log in which Camilla explicitly instructed her media team to mercilessly exploit his past psychological wounds to undermine his current leadership ability. A deathly silence fell over the room. This was no longer a mere political power struggle. It was a brutal betrayal on both familial and moral grounds. The advisors who had always revered royal stability and honor could no longer conceal their contempt. The most senior advisor, who had served 3 monarchs, slowly rose to his feet. His movement served as a signal of finality. He did not look at Camilla. Instead, he looked directly at William and gave a slight nod of complete acknowledgement. The council's turn away from her happened without noise, yet it was utterly decisive. They began gathering their papers. The eyes that once held respect for Camilla now filled only with cold rejection. Camilla sat alone amid the emptying chairs as the advisors moved one by one toward William. The chandelier above cast a chilly pool of light, stretching her shadow long and dark across the marble floor. The truth had not only been exposed, it had become an irreversible political death sentence. In the eerie silence of the council chamber, Camilla understood that she had lost not only her power, but also her final place in the history of the monarchy. Within the stone walls of Windsor Castle, a historic change was unfolding in a silence so profound it numbed the senses. Camilla's final attempts to salvage her position vanished completely the moment the official report from the Advisory Council reached the king's hands. The most conservative advisors, once her quiet supporters, now moved in unison, forming a united front that demanded full transparency and an immediate non-negotiable transfer of power. Pressure from government offices and simmering outrage within the royal inner circle created an iron vice that tightened relentlessly around the woman who had once believed she controlled the entire game. Camilla descended into total collapse. Yet it was not the collapse of a victim, but the exhaustion of a gambler who had lost everything on one final desperate bet. She spent her days locked inside darkened rooms where even the footsteps of her remaining servants grew sparse and cautious. Her once sharp eyes had turned dull, staring vacantly at the priceless antiques that had symbolized her power. Now nothing more than lifeless ornaments in a lavish tomb. The isolation cut deep as she realized her calls went unanswered, and her former allies were frantically erasing every trace of their connection to her in order to save their own careers. The final punishment came not through any loud public decree, but in a cold private meeting between Camilla and Princess Anne. Anne, the embodiment of order and dynastic honor, presented terms that allowed no negotiation. She demanded that Camilla immediately withdraw from all centers of power, retire to a remote residence, and severely limit her public appearances. It was an exile wrapped in hollow dignity, a gradual ira from the flow of history designed to protect what little remained of the monarchy's image. Anne's gaze held no triumph as she looked at Camilla, only a cold surgical resolve. The same detachment with which one amputates a gangrenous limb to save the body. While darkness closed in around Camilla, a new era was dawning on the other side of the palace. William and Catherine appeared in the main hall, preparing for a direct address to the nation. William stood tall in full ceremonial uniform, his broad shoulders bearing the weight of a people desperate for stability. Catherine remained at his side, graceful and steadfast. Her composure throughout the media storm had become a symbol of the quiet strength expected of a future queen. Their minds were not filled with the thrill of victory, but with a profound sense of relief mingled with heavy responsibility. They understood that the family fractures created to reach this moment would never fully heal. The great doors of the palace swung open. A wave of camera flashes and the roar of the waiting crowd surged inside like a breaking tide. William took Catherine's hand and squeezed it firmly. A silent vow stronger than any spoken words. As they stepped onto the balcony, the brilliant afternoon sunlight of London poured over the crown and the rows of metals bathing the scene in splendor. Behind them, in the deep shadowed corridors where light could not reach, Camilla's figure grew fainter and finally disappeared behind closing doors. An era of schemes and darkness had officially ended, making way for the beginning of a new reign, one in which trust and honor stood above personal ambition. The bells of Westminster Abbey rang out joyfully, marking the moment William and Catherine truly became the soul of the kingdom and opened a promising new chapter in the history of the British royal family. After finishing the story, in your opinion, was the decisive action taken by Princess Anne and Prince William a necessary protection for the throne? Or was it an excessively harsh punishment toward Queen Camilla? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.